photos were released to social media of Israeli Defense Force soldiers rounding up men, stripped to their underpants, kneeling on the street, I think with their hands behind their back, before being loaded and driven away onto the back of a truck. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, I spent 34 years in the army and I spent 3 years in Somalia, and I never saw anything like that. I took thousands of prisoners in the Gulf War. I dealt with suicide bombers in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia, but I've never, ever dealt with a civilian detainee like that. This looks and feels wrong.
What is it like to have helped plan an invasion for a war that you now consider to be one of the worst strategic mistakes in recent British history? Our next guest on Downstream, Major General Charlie Herbert's probably been popping up on your TV screens, being one of the most vociferous critics of Israel's bombardment of Gaza. And today we talk about the invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, and the reasons why conscription might not work for Britain in the 21st century. Major General Charlie Herbert, thank you so much for joining us. Just a quick question. Does your post get addressed to Major General, or are you just plain old Charlie Herbert?
I think it depends on who you are. There are lots of people that love their rank and never let go of it, Ash. The only time I ever use it is on media, interestingly enough, which is a funny one. So no, I don't have it on my credit card. No, my post is not addressed to it. And I kind of dropped my rank about 4 years ago when I left the army. But every now and again, I go, am I really a Major General? It comes up on the screen every now and again.
For many of our viewers, they'll have seen you in recent weeks and months popping up on mainstream media to give opinions which lots of people would say are quite critical of the position of the British government. How unusual is that for someone who's been in your line of work?
Yeah, Ash, we tend to be gagged, if I'm being quite honest, when we're serving. We're not allowed to speak to the media without express position, and it's very rare that you'll find a serving military officer speaking to the military. And when they do, it tends to be quite censored, to be quite honest. On leaving the army, when inevitably you're given a sort of greater platform and greater freedoms to say what you like. So there are no limits on what I can say. There are no limits on my honesty, no limits on my candidness. I mean, you're right. I have been relatively critical of this government over the last few years, and it mainly started in 2021 during the evacuation from Afghanistan, when I saw this government behave in what I thought was a fairly shameful way, in the way in which it was treating those Afghans which had supported us, those Afghans who'd supported us, our interpreters, many Afghan special forces that had worked alongside our own forces, put their lives at risk, those who'd helped guard the British embassy, those who'd worked with civil society organisations and women's organisations who were left behind, who in my view should have been relocated to the UK when we evacuated. So I found myself, as part of a larger group of people on a bit of a media campaign to criticise the government, to try to affect policy, to try and change policy. Now, it's interesting that, for the last 3 years, what I've been campaigning in particular for Afghan interpreters, one of my final interpreters got to the UK yesterday, which is kind of lovely. 3 years. It took 3 years to get him eligibility. It took a long time to get him out of Afghanistan into Pakistan. And then it took a lot of time to get him a visa to come to the UK. He arrived. And then, as some of your viewers will inevitably have picked up, since sort of late October, probably late October, early November, I've been fairly vociferous in my condemnation, not just of the British government's support to the Israelis, but actually of the Israelis themselves and the way in which they are executing or conducting this campaign against Hamas. And I've always said, Ash, that I understand Israel's right to self-defense. I understand that inevitably some form of military action was inevitable after the 7th of October. But I've always said that we must view this as part of a continuum of violence that's taken place over the last century. History didn't start on the 7th of October. This war didn't start on the 7th of October. What really saddens me, Ash, and the piece that that I talk extensively about is, if Israel had reacted differently to the 7th of October, if it had just taken the time to draw breath, to think about what had happened, to see its role in the 7th of October, to understand that it had contributed significantly to creating the conditions that led to the 7th of October. If it had done that, and I mean, if it had responded strategically, addressing the root causes of this conflict, dealing with the grievances of the Palestinians, and with a determination, a genuine determination to solve this problem, then I wouldn't be critical. But what I've seen is just an angry response to the 7th of October, a response that, in my view, lacked distinction between combatants and civilians, a response that I think lacks proportionality. I mean, so many innocents killed in this war, and a response that has bordered on illegal.
I want to get into the situation in Gaza in quite some detail in just a bit, but just so our viewers can get to know you just a little bit more, why did you pursue a military career in the first place? How did you make that decision as a younger man?
I always wanted to be a soldier, strangely. I was a serial underachiever at school, I think, if truth be told. I left school at 16. I joined the army as a soldier at 17 at the very earliest opportunity. And I loved soldiering, I really did. And I think it often receives an unfair press, to be quite honest, the military profession. Most of my life has been spent about saving. Most of my career was about saving lives, not taking lives. So I joined the army in 1985, at the back end of the Cold War. The first few years were spent in Germany and Northern Ireland. Ultimately, I spent about 4 years in Northern Ireland in the 1980s and the 1990s. So I sort of got a feel for how you wage war, or how you support the police, how you conduct military operations in support of civilian authorities against a terrorist enemy. And a lot of my experiences of Northern Ireland have, to a certain extent, shaped my thoughts on what's going on in Gaza. But after Northern Ireland and Germany, I served in the Balkans in the 1990s. I saw war amongst the people. I saw what happens when humanitarian aid is blocked. I saw what happens when civilians become a target. I saw what happens when civilians are massacred. I saw what happens, when genocide takes place in places like Srebrenica. And that inevitably sort of shaped my thinking on warfare and how warfare should be fought. And then, of course, for the last sort of 15 to 20 years of my military career, what I call the post 9/11 years, they were spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. What everyone thinks about Iraq, those of us that served there went there because we believed we were doing the right thing at the time. I look back on it now. I realise it was probably one of the greatest strategic errors that the United States and the UK have done in the last sort of century. It was an extraordinary strategic error invading Iraq. But the work that I did there, 2005, 2008, we were sort of doing our best. And then I did sort of 3 tours in Afghanistan as well, and various other places that I've served. So I kind of love the army. As I say, most of my time was spent saving lives. The most satisfying time that I spent in the army was in Sierra Leone during Ebola, during the Ebola crisis, where we were working with the international community, and we were working hard to defeat the Ebola pandemic, to save lives and bring that pandemic to an end. And, I set up a little charity helping to look after disadvantaged children after that. So at heart, I'm a humanitarian, but I don't think there is any juxtaposition between being a humanitarian at heart and being a military officer. I think that's absolutely normal. I spent 34 years in the army, and even after that, I then went off to Somalia as a civilian and did a similar job, afterwards.
How quickly did it dawn on you that Iraq was a strategic mistake for the UK and America?
A great question. I was a relatively young officer in 2002. I was working in the Ministry of Defence. I was one of many officers that was involved in planning the invasion of Iraq. And I'll be honest with you, Ash, I bought into the evidence which we were presented. I bought into what is now known as the dodgy dossier, the weapons of mass destruction. I believed in it. I believed in the intelligence that was presented to me, probably because I was part of an institution where one didn't necessarily question everything in those days. As I got a bit older and a little bit more experienced, I would have been more circumspect about the intelligence that I was presented. But I believe that we were doing this for the right reasons. So I have to say, as we went from late 2002 into early 2003, I genuinely thought that Tony Blair, the then president, I thought the reason that he was so close to the Americans is that he could influence them positively. And I thought that ultimately he would influence the Americans not to invade Iraq in early 2003. And I think I, like many other colleagues of mine at that time, was surprised in late February, end of late February, early March 2003, when the UK committed to invading Iraq alongside the Americans. How quickly did I realise it was going wrong? Um, Certainly by the end of 2003. There was no proper plan for what followed. And again, we'll talk about this in the context of Gaza. Military activity is fine. It'll only get you so far. But it won't solve all of your problems. It won't solve inherently political problems. And you've got to work out what follows that military action. And this is the bit we kind of got fundamentally wrong in Iraq. We never really worked out what would happen in Iraq after we had outed Saddam Hussein and defeated the Iraqi army. And the next, 6 or 7 years were utterly disastrous.
I mean, it's interesting that you frame it as a strategic mistake, but listening to you and listening to the trust that you had in the institution of the British government and the Ministry of Defence, that sounds to me a lot more like a moral mistake, that there was a betrayal there, that you weren't given the correct information to be able to make a fair judgment. And the people who ended up paying the price for that ultimately were the servicemen and women who lost their lives and the many thousands of civilians in Iraq.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody's necessarily been held responsible for those decisions that were taken. Right from the very top, from the Prime Minister down. Yeah, we went in there on flawed intelligence, flawed information, flawed planning assumptions. One of the assumptions is that we would be out of Iraq in any sizable strength within a year. I mean, I was back there, in 2008. We still had 7,000 or 8,000 soldiers there, I think, in 2007, 2008. Yeah, and who paid the price? The Iraqi people. And not just for a short period of time. They paid the price for a decade afterwards. Arguably, they're still paying the price for the consequences. A lot of the problems which we see in the Middle East stem back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. You're absolutely legally questionable, no doubt about it. Morally questionable, no doubt about it. I mean, I don't think any of my colleagues would necessarily sort of look back and try and justify what we did. We did it based on the information that we were presented with at the time. As I say, I was a relatively junior officer, but I'm not proud of my part in it at all. Absolutely not. I wish I had seen the bigger picture and been better able to challenge people. It never occurred to me in late 2002 and 2003 that this intelligence was flawed and I should be challenging people. It never occurred to me.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, because one of my assumptions would be that as someone who is working in the military, you'd have access to better quality information than the rest of us who are civilians. Is that ever the case, that in the military you get higher quality information and then what we get out here is the spin? Or are you being spun when you're in there and you're an officer?
It's a brilliant question. Do we get access to better information and intelligence? Yeah, it's more classified, and the sources of that information tend to be more secretive. Man intelligence may come from what we call human intelligence. It may come from a person passing us, an agent who's passing us intelligence, covertly or overtly. It could come from signals intelligence, where we've intercepted something on the internet or radio signals. It could come from images. It's this whole collection that allows of information and data that allows one to build up a picture against which you can make decisions and take action. And again, if you look at the sort of not just Iraq, but the context of 9/11 or the context of the 7th of October, there was a lot of intelligence out there, a lot of information out there that suggested that 9/11 might be coming, as I understand there was about the 7th of October last year. But whether that information was corralled and assessed and analysed correctly, and whether people drew the right deductions from that information, is more questionable. Very often the intelligence is there and the information is there, but it's very difficult to join all the dots and to pull an accurate picture out. And when people talk about failed military intelligence or failed strategic intelligence, they're normally talking about the failure of the right analysis. The information was there. And often as you say, Ash, a lot of days nowadays, that information is available in open source. It's available in the media. It's out there, and now with access to satellite imagery, a lot of that imagery is available to everybody, if they're willing to pay for it. It's not necessarily only the military that have it. But yeah, it's mistakes happen. We do our best. Huge resources of government, whether that is the secret intelligence services, whether that is MI5, whether that is the defence intelligence services, whether that is the GCHQ, our intelligence, other intelligence agency, all hoovering up as much information and intelligence as they can in order to make the right decisions. But inevitably, sometimes the wrong decisions are made.
Something that my husband has become obsessed with at the moment is metacognition. He's obsessed with the way in which we think about things and the impediments we have to seeing things clearly. And because he's obsessed with it, like a kind of osmosis process, I've become interested in it too, because, you live with someone. And one of the things that he talks a lot about is institutional culture and how institutional culture can create a kind of confirmation bias. So when an institution's dealing with vast quantities of information, the culture of the institution shapes and curtails how that information is going to be interpreted. From your experience in the army, what was the culture around interpreting information? What were the biases that shaped how intelligence would be, I guess, metabolized and put to use?
Best described by a colourful British diplomat called Sir Gerald Cooper-Coles, who was the British ambassador to Kabul during our war in Afghanistan. And in a book and several speeches, he talked about this institutional culture of the British military, and he talked about the incurable optimism of the UK military. This extraordinary self-belief that things would turn out okay as we wanted and as we anticipated. And that's a deep flaw. I'm not suggesting that we should all have a sort of pessimism bias, but there is a danger of being incurably optimistic. And the military takes pride in that. There's this remarkable can-do attitude. And I loved working with the military. I loved working with my peers. They generally could get stuff done when other people were unable to, whether that was the delivery of humanitarian aid in difficult circumstances or whatever it was. But often we would look at a problem, a conflict problem, and with overly optimistic bias, in my view. And let's take Afghanistan. I think, we said, okay, we can oust the Taliban. And we can do that pretty successfully. We can install a new government under President Karzai. And hey, so there's going to be a counterinsurgency over the next 15 to 20 years, but we're pretty good at this. We'll win this. And that kind of optimism bias, year after year after year after year, you fail to see what you're not making the progress which you had sought to make. And you're almost incapable of seeing that you're not making the progress. And sometimes you're incapable of seeing where things are going wrong. And I think this is certainly, to a certain extent, what happened in Iraq. And I think to a certain extent, this is what happened in Afghanistan. And it is, and as you say, what is the institutional culture? It is a culture of perpetual optimism, I think, in the military. This can-do approach, which is a huge strength, but as I've outlined there, can also be an enormous weakness as well. And I don't know if the military has addressed that over the last few years since I left, but I suspect not, Ash.
I mean, I'm obviously speculating here, but does that kind of optimism come from Britain's historic place in the world, where you could be, a guy from Wiltshire and end up striding around the world in khaki shorts, installing leaders here and there and shaping the destiny of places which were very, very far away from your own context? Obviously, the world's changed a lot since then, but is that the sort of self-image of what?
The military's been around, the army's been around for what, 350 years? It does take great pride. And again, there are strengths in having that kind of historical legacy. There are also weaknesses to it, and you allude to that, that colonial legacy. I suspect there's an element of truth in what you say there, Ash. It's a bit awkward for me to admit that, having spent 34 years, in the military. Where does that come from? It helps to be optimistic in the military. It's a very demanding, it's a very challenging, at times very dangerous role, and we're littered with adversity and with tragedy at times. And I suppose part of one's training as an officer from the very earliest stages at Sandhurst, our military academy, is to be optimistic, to not show undue concern, to show weakness. Troops don't want their officers to be weak and riddled with self-doubt. troops generally want their officers to have a degree of confidence. You don't want to be led by somebody who says, "Hey, look, we're going over the top tomorrow, but I think we're all going to die." But troops don't like that kind of approach. So there's this element of not daring do, but this an element of optimism, an element of confidence, which is encouraged in the military leadership. But that has to be balanced with the humility that one gains with age and experience. That it's not all going to be plain sailing, and sometimes we things are going to unravel. I mean, there's another great saying in the military: "No plan survives contact with the enemy," and this is very true. You spend a lot of time planning. You can come up with the most perfect plan, but the moment things go live, the moment the bullets start whizzing, things start to rapidly unfold, and you've got to think on your feet. Does that answer your question? It's a really interesting question, and
It
I think
does.
there's something about what you say there, this sort of almost colonial legacy of the military and the UK.
I mean, you said no plan survives contact with the enemy. I thought of Mike Tyson. Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
No, I mean it's exactly right. It's exactly right. Nothing survives contact with the enemy. Nothing survives a punch in the face. Then you're making it up.
Something which I've always wondered is, how do operational decisions about the level of force happen in the army, both over the course of an offensive and on a day-to-day level? How does a decision get made about which bomb to use, how powerful it is, how much hardware is being used in particular circumstances?
It's a great question, that one. And how long do we have? And I'd want to pull in a couple of friends who do targeting and some specialists to get involved in that kind of discussion. So if you take most campaigns, most conflicts that I've been involved in, you take Northern Ireland. The simple rule was minimum force and self-defense only. So every soldier carried a little white card, which was Fablon, and he carried it in his pocket, and he read it every day, and he was tested, but he understood it every single day. And it was your rules of engagement for opening fire on somebody, using lethal force in a place like Northern Ireland, inside the United Kingdom. And the legal basis was self-defense only. You could only open fire in self-defense only if there was no other way of stopping that threat. It was very clear. So something like Northern Ireland, your rules of engagement, the laws which govern you are very clear, minimum rules. In Iraq and Afghanistan, when I was serving there, after the conflict phases were over, again, the principles were minimum force. You knew you were fighting a war against, whether it was the Taliban or whether it was Iranian-backed militia in southern Iraq, amongst a civilian population. So there were times when, yes, you might have been able to fire a missile at somebody. You might have been legally justified in shooting somebody, but you wouldn't do it because of the presence of civilians. And a lot of this comes down to an individual decision making, at that moment. And then you kind of you wind up the spectrum to major combat operations, kind of where we are perhaps in Gaza and what the Israelis view themselves as doing. And the Israeli Defense Forces clearly see themselves as war fighting in Gaza. So they apply an entirely different set of rules and principles to what they're doing. And, and this is where it gets kind of complicated. And this is where international humanitarian law plays a very significant part. And it determines what you can and what you cannot do, where you can and where you cannot target, when a hospital is protected by law and when a hospital may not be protected by law. And those kind of decisions will all be taken by lawyers. Military commanders in the Ministry of Defence will be working with their integral lawyers to take advice on those particular issues. In terms of choosing what weapon you use, again, this is a really kind of difficult and complex subject. And if we put it back into the Gaza context, I've used this scenario with various people. If let's say you've got 5 Hamas gunmen in a building and one civilian, and you need to kill those 5 those 5 Hamas gunmen. Is it ethical, moral, and legitimate that one civilian dies as collateral damage. And I hate that term, but is it? And many people would say, yeah, that's probably proportionate. If there are 10 civilians in that building, then your calculus change. If there are 100 civilians that are going to die as a result of you dropping a bomb from a plane, 100 civilians are going to die for you to kill 5 lowly Hamas terrorists, but don't necessarily need to be killed that day, then I'd argue that you wouldn't do it. But every military will apply slightly different targeting processes to this. But does that make sense? It's these sort of legal principles about proportionality, and you can get 5 people in a room. I'll give you 5 different answers on this one, but a lot of it comes down to military necessity. A lot of this comes down to, and this is where I have issues with what's going on in Gaza a lot of the time.
I mean, I was interested in your characterization of what was going on in Northern Ireland as minimal force. There would obviously be lots of people in Northern Ireland who would object to that characterization, and they might cite things like the Bloody Sunday massacre, what happened to Pat Finucane, the sort of, the abuses of, predominantly, Irish Catholic individuals in Northern Ireland. Do you think that there is a big mismatch between how the army perceives itself and its use of force and how people who are subject to occupation perceive and experience that force? Because to give you an example of 5 Hamas gunmen and 1 civilian, as an abstract, I might go, yeah, I can understand the calculation. But if that 1 civilian was my mum, I can tell you that I wouldn't feel like it was an ethical decision made by, an occupying army.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you're absolutely right, and you raised some really interesting questions here. I think if you serve as an occupying force, whether that is in Northern Ireland, or whether that is in southern Iraq, or whether that is in Gaza, one needs good leadership to understand what that means and what that means for those who are occupied. I was always very conscious, but when you're walking around, okay, so Northern Ireland, I was first served in Northern Ireland, I was probably about 18, and I remember my first night patrol, and it took place in a tough estate in West Belfast, a Republican estate in West Belfast. I got out of the back of an armoured vehicle with my rifle in my hands, and there was a burning vehicle, and I looked around me, and I remember thinking, wow, this looks like the West Midlands where I grew up. This is kind of really weird. I never expected to be trolling around a housing estate in the United Kingdom with an assault rifle in my hands, but I am. And the next morning I went back out on patrol, and you find yourself talking to people, and how they view you. They're inevitably quite scared. They're genuinely quite intimidated by somebody who is armed, carrying a rifle, in combat clothing, wearing a helmet, sometimes wearing dark glasses or whatever it is, maybe a visor, often driving around in armored vehicles where you're pretty much impersonal and unseen. That is intimidating to a civilian population. And again, Ash, to kind of put this in the context of Gaza and some of the things we've seen, one of the things I was most uncomfortable with, and where I got quite vociferous in my condemnation of the IDF, was in early December, when some photos were released to social media of Israeli Defense Force soldiers rounding up men. And there are these photographs of a group of about 80 men, stripped to their underpants, kneeling on the street, I think with their hands behind their back, before being loaded and driven away onto the back of a truck. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, I spent 34 years in the army, and I spent 3 years in Somalia, and I never saw anything like that. I took thousands of prisoners in the Gulf War. I dealt with suicide bombers in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia, but I've never, ever dealt with a civilian detainee like that. This looks and feels wrong to me. It just looks really wrong. And I remember trying to explain this to people, and people going, oh, you're being wet, Charlie. You're being pathetic. They're probably terrorists. And I said, no, they're not. 80% of them were released. And you knew that was going to happen. 80% were released after cursory, interrogation or questioning. And I said, how do you think those men felt? How would you feel if you're a 45-year-old, you're caught up in a war zone at home, an armed force turns up with its tanks and all of this, you're marched out of your house, you're stripped to your underpants, somebody's holding a weapon to your head, tell me you're not going to be scared. And then they cart you away in a lorry, then they interrogate you, and then they just chuck you in the desert and tell you to go home. First thing is going to be relief. And the second thing at the end of that is going to be hatred and resentment. And it's illogical. It's not just immoral, Ash, to treat people like that. I don't need to tell you that. It's illogical as an occupying power to do that, as any kind of military force, however legitimate you may be. It's completely illogical because you breed resentment and hatred. You simply create the next generation of those that are going to rise up and take up arms against you. And that, I'm afraid, is what I think we're seeing in Gaza. To a lesser extent, but equally, it's taking place, I think, in the West Bank and has been for decades. And you see it everywhere where military force is misapplied or applied inappropriately against a civilian population.
I mean, we've seen footage of Israeli soldiers rummaging through the underwear drawers of women and taking negligees and putting it at the front of their armoured vehicles like a mascot, making jokes about destroying educational facilities, desecrating homes, and at the extreme, even firing and killing, firing live rounds at and killing Palestinian civilians waving white flags. When you see those images, as someone who's had soldiers under their command, does that look to you like a breakdown of discipline within the IDF? Or does that look to you like a much more generalised culture with signals of permissibility coming from the top?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I've been quite vocal on social media in my condemnation of this. But occasionally I have to draw a distinction. War is traumatic, whatever the nature of a war. And I'm not necessarily supporting the IDF here, but there will be young soldiers who have been pulled up, mobilized, and sent to conflict and put into a very, very difficult situation. Some of those Israeli soldiers, very, very decent people, many of them will be. Let's be frank about that. And war is dehumanizing and it's frightening. And for some of them, they're just letting off steam. And some of these pictures that you see of, teenage kids dancing, just doing silly stuff, TikTok videos, I have no problem with that. The stuff which is just letting off steam, I have no problem. I've seen British soldiers do that in Iraq. I've seen them do it in Afghanistan. When you start rummaging through, civilian houses and pulling out lingerie, that's not letting off steam. That's not harmless. That's deeply offensive. When you celebrate, and film the deliberate destruction of mosques and hospitals and universities and houses, when you do that, you've kind of crossed a line, haven't you? And to me, that's I don't believe those are individual acts. I think what we have seen, the extent of what we've seen, suggests to me a culture of impunity within the Israeli Defense Forces, but they feel that they can do this and video it and post it on social media with no action going to be taken. So a culture of impunity. But one almost senses that they're almost encouraged to do this. No action is going to be taken against them. So it just becomes sort of self-fulfilling. It's a very, very dangerous place to be. As I mentioned, war dehumanizes. War needs sound military discipline. And great leadership. Two things it needs: military discipline and great leadership. And if you don't have that, the dehumanizing effect of war, can have very, very significant consequences. And I will not say that the British military have been completely blameless during my career. There were one or two very isolated incidents of war crimes that took place in Basra in 2003, for which people rightly went to jail. They were court-martialed, prosecuted, and they went to jail. And there was a very public case in Afghanistan a few years ago where a serviceman shot dead a wounded Taliban soldier. And he was prosecuted and he was rightly sent to jail. And if you don't have this leadership, if you don't have this discipline, things will spiral out of control, from stupid videos and dehumanizing stuff to incidences of criminality and more significant behavior, Ash. And that's why I call it out. It's abhorrent, it's foolish. It's not what you expect from a professional army. And if the Israeli Defense Forces want to be seen globally as a professional army, they need to behave as such. Otherwise, they lose any of the legitimacy and authority which they seek to have after the 7th of October.
I mean, do you get the sense that the international outcry just doesn't really matter to the IDF? What matters is that they enjoy very strong support amongst the Israeli population at large. They enjoy widespread political support from every major party in Israeli politics. And so the outcry from those of us based in the UK is sort of by the by.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been fairly clear on this. They don't care what we say. They've made that clear. I mean, what have they said? They said we'll just kind of ignore any ruling of the ICJ, and we don't care. We're just not going to accept it. Yeah, and you've hit the kind of nail on the head. I mean, what's important to the IDF? Domestic politics and domestic support, and as you rightly say, they've got that. And who is their key ally in this conflict? It's the United States. And it appears to me that they can do pretty much what they want when they want, and still retain that support from the US government at the moment. Not necessarily every US person, but they seem to go in. And they don't really. I think they're oblivious to what you or I think. I think they're oblivious to the tens of thousands of people who protest and march. They're oblivious, I think, to those people who vote in the UN General Assembly, or all of those who vote in the UN Security Council. I think they're just, I don't think they care. I think they want to get the job done, and they're going to pay the consequences in order to do that. It just seems to be the way in which they're going.
Are the sort of criticisms that you're coming out with, these criticisms of the Israeli army, the Israeli government, Israel's attitude to international law, are these being echoed by other people in military circles, or are you sort of going out on a limb here?
I mean, this is the most polarizing conflict in my lifetime, and you see society is polarized on this, and people take very, very ardent views one way or the other. And you see that likewise amongst the veteran community, and you see that also, I think, amongst the serving military community when I speak to people. I mean, the one thing I was told right at the outset, and I think it's really good advice, is try not to take sides in this war. And I do try not to take sides. I mean, I'm non-partisan. I don't have a dog in this fight, so to speak. I'm outraged by some of the things I see. Let's be honest, Ash, I was outraged by the 7th of October. And if anybody calls me a Hamas supporter, boy, I'll tell them where I stand on this, because I am not. What they did was absolutely abhorrent, but I absolutely agree it didn't take place in a vacuum, and the conflict didn't start on the 7th of October. But what Hamas did on the 7th of October in no way justifies some of the things which we've seen from the Israeli Defense Forces, and that's why I'm critical, equally critical of the Israeli Defense Forces as I have been of Hamas. And where I kind of get really quite critical, Ash, is in the conduct of this campaign, because I find it illogical. This is an inherently political problem that requires an inherently political solution. You can't solve every problem by hitting it with a hammer. I mean, you can't. Yet Israel seems to think that you can do. And as somebody said quite early in this campaign, when you are one of the most militarized countries in the world, every problem looks like it might be fixed by a tank. and I think that is slightly how Israel are kind of viewing this. But as you and I know, this problem will not be resolved by military force alone. It will not. It will achieve a temporary respite. Let's say the guns fall silent tomorrow, Ash, or in a month's time, or in 3 months' time. What have they actually achieved? Well, in my view, they've temporarily defeated Hamas. If you were to stop it about now or in a month's time, that's all they've done. They've got respite, but they haven't solved anything else. They haven't addressed the issue of occupation. They haven't addressed the issues of two-state solution. They haven't addressed any of the issues pertaining to, the socio-economic conditions inside Gaza. And unless Israel deal with that, this is entirely pointless. And that's what makes me really sad, Ash. That 30,000 people
I
are going to
mean,
die for no useful effect, no long-term thing. Nothing good is going to come out of this unless something fundamentally changes.
I mean, you mentioned that if the guns were to fall silent tomorrow, what Israel may have achieved is a temporary defeat of Hamas. Many senior Hamas leaders and militants still remain at large. The political leadership is still in Qatar. I mean, will Israel have achieved even that? Or will there have been obviously a reduction in the number of Hamas fighters, but another generation of people who will have legitimate grievances against the Israeli state and may want to take up arms against the Israeli state because of those legitimate grievances?
I mean, absolutely. So tactically, the war tactics, operations, strategy. So, tactically, if a war was to stop in the next few weeks, have they recovered the hostages so far? No. So they failed on that tactical objective. Have they captured and killed the senior Hamas leadership in Gaza? No. So they failed on that tactical objective. Have they destroyed all the tunnels? No. It's going to take a very long time, so they failed on that. Have they prevented any rocket attacks? No, because they'll start again pretty quickly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So no, they haven't achieved that. But even if they achieved all of that, Ash, even if they capture Yahya Sinwar, even if they destroy all the tunnels, you're absolutely right. If they do all of that, but it doesn't equate to strategic success. It doesn't prevent Hamas or something like Hamas emerging from the ashes of this and continuing this kind of campaign, then it's all a waste of time anyway. And this has always been my point. My point. Yeah, unless all of this is about creating the conditions for negotiated political accommodation that addresses the issue of who lives where and how, unless that is what we're ultimately doing, what's the point? Israel's been at war since 1948, 1967, 1973, 1982, 2006, 2014. And unless we address, unless the international community, Israel, Palestine, and their neighbours, address these issues, we'll just be rewatching this, sadly, in 5 years' time, Ash, and 10 years' time, and 20 years' time. And as I say to kids, there's a real danger, unless this is addressed, this is going to dominate their lifetime in the same way that it's dominated my lifetime. And I think there's a chance here. 7th of October was so awful. This war is so awful. It has to be the catalyst, Ash, for change. It's got to be the point, at which all sides work towards a long-term enduring solution. A bit like where we were in the early 1990s with this determination through the Oslo Accords to find a solution. But there has to be a solution this time. There has to be. It's tragic if it is tragic. We owe it to all of those people who've died, all of those people who've been orphaned, all of those that have lost a child. It's owed to them to find a solution now.
I want to shift the conversation a bit more towards Afghanistan, because, as you mentioned earlier, you spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. Today, the Taliban control more territory in Afghanistan than they did before 9/11. Would it be fair to say that, all told, the Taliban had a very good war and Britain and America had a very bad one? Or is the picture more complex than that?
I think you sum it up really nicely. Taliban were victorious after a 20-year campaign, and the United States-led coalition and NATO were roundly defeated in Afghanistan after a 20-year campaign. It is as simple as that. One can dress it up. People sometimes forget why we were there. We were there after 9/11. Had the Taliban handed over the Al-Qaeda leadership in late 2001, there probably would never have been a war against Afghanistan. History would have been very different. Had that happened, there may never have been an invasion of Iraq in 2003. But the Taliban chose not to, and they left the United States with little option but to launch military action to eliminate Al-Qaeda. And I do believe it was justified in the UN Security Council resolution. I think there was general international support for that action in late 2001 after 9/11. It's what followed that. It's what happened after the beginning of 2002. We won the war, the Taliban were ousted, but we lost the peace over the next 20 years. And that's potentially because talks took place, the Bonn Agreement, all those talks took place. But who wasn't in the room for those talks? The Taliban. They weren't in the room. They were not included. It was considered a step too far. So consequently, the major actor who needed to be involved in post-conflict talks was excluded. Let's go back to Gaza briefly. People tell you that Hamas should not be included in future talks. It's exactly like saying that the Taliban should not have been included in Bonn. That didn't work well. I just raised that just to be a little bit cheeky. And you've got to talk to your enemy even while you're fighting them. And when you exclude them from talks, you potentially exacerbate the problem. Anyway, but does that make sense?
It does. It does make sense. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about this might be apocryphal, but apparently the Taliban famously said to the Americans, "You have the watches, but we have the time," i.e. we can wait out your occupation. At some point, it's going to become too expensive, too difficult to maintain. Is there a general rule that a homegrown insurgency will always, in the long term, beat a foreign occupation?
It's a dozen PhD subjects all on its own, that one, and again there are many different views on this one. How would I answer that? If you're a Western liberal democracy that wants to fight your counterinsurgency campaign legally, then it's very, very difficult for you to win that war. If you choose to fight that war with limited concern for international views, for legality, distinction, proportionality, then you can potentially crush your opponent. And when one sort of looks at history, at what people would describe as successful counterinsurgency campaign, they've been pretty ruthless, and they certainly wouldn't stand up to scrutiny in the 21st century. They would not stand up to scrutiny in the 21st century. I'm trying to think of some successful counterinsurgency campaigns of the last 20 years, and the only two that I can kind of really think of would be the Russians against the Chechens in the Second Grozny War, which was fought in a pretty ugly manner. Nobody would say that was fought with legality, distinction, or proportionality, or the Sri Lankan defeat of the Tamil Tigers. And of course,
which again, the proportionality, legality, use of force. I mean, many Tamils describe what happened as a genocide.
Absolutely. And I think those two are, those are the two examples of where an insurgency was crushed. But Western liberal democracies are not in the business of doing that, by and large. Where's Gaza sit on this one? Does it sit somewhere between the two? It's a really interesting question, this one. Is it appropriate to conduct a campaign, a major warfighting campaign, as we're seeing in Gaza, against a non-state actor like Hamas or the Taliban? In my view, it's ineffective. But coming back to Afghanistan, a bit like Vietnam. I think an American officer said that you never defeated, he said to a Vietnamese officer after war, "You never defeated us tactically on the battlefield." And the Vietnamese officer said, "Yes, but that was kind of irrelevant because we beat you strategically." And it's exactly the same with the Taliban. Most military engagements, where you kind of shooting's going on, we kind of beat them there. But as you say, they had greater support. They appear to have been a more attractive proposition to the people of Afghanistan than what we were offering through Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani. And that's kind of difficult. I really believed in that war, Ash. I was involved in, Afghanistan and the Ministry of Defence in the early 2000s. I served there in 2007. I served there in 2010. I served there in 2017, 18. Absolutely loved the place. I love the Afghans. I really believe, we called it the good war. We thought it was a good war. We genuinely thought we were doing the right thing. And I'm very conflicted, Ash, even to this day, because some of what we did was really good. We got girls into school, Ash. We got a generation of girls into school, educated, through university and into jobs. We fundamentally changed their lives. We throughout that campaign, we introduced equal rights and human rights and civil rights. All of this was kind of brought into Afghanistan for a 20-year period. To my dying day, I will always be very proud of what I did and the part that I did to support that. But it always makes me very, very sad. But ultimately, the end of that was failure. All of that fell apart in August 2021 when we left and the Taliban literally walked straight back into Kabul. And everything we did was undermined. The only thing we've left behind is hope, I believe, hope. You see these incredibly brave young women in Afghanistan, week after week, who march, in protest at the Taliban, not allowing them to have an education, not allowing them to go to university, not allowing them to have jobs. We've given that younger generation a hope, and my ardent hope, Ash, is that the Taliban will fall in sufficient time for those young girls to realise their dreams and their aspirations, because that's what we gave them. We gave them hopes and dreams and aspirations, and I really hope that they do get them. It's difficult. I lost a lot of friends and a lot of colleagues in that war. Yeah, I believe by and large what we did was done for the right reasons. It's very difficult that it ended in the way that it did.
I mean, to play devil's advocate, some would say that hopes, dreams, aspirations, and education are very important, but you can't eat hopes, dreams, and aspirations. The post-coalition governments, they were strongest around Kabul. They didn't substantively impact living standards outside of Kabul. And outside of Kabul, what you had was chaos and you had corruption. So if you're a rural Afghan, sure, you might want your daughter to go to school. But more than that, you want to be able to get through your day without having to pay bribes or be subject to violent threats, and to perhaps have the possibility of living on more than a couple of dollars a day. I mean, that would be the case for the opposition almost of why a regime as brutal as the Taliban was in the end more attractive. I mean, what do you make of that theory?
100%, totally. It's almost like you listened to me in the past and we've had this conversation, previously. 100% agree with you. Yeah, if you're a young farmer, living in Sangin in Helmand, right down in southern Afghanistan, yeah, an education for your daughter is great. That's nice. Really, you want your daughter to be able to walk around without fear that she's going to lose her legs, or that she's going to get shot, by an American or a British soldier, or that something awful. You're absolutely right. The most important thing for everybody is to have security. And as sad as I am about the way in which the war ended, I do think about those people in Helmand. I think about those people in places like Sangin and Musa Qala and Nowzad and Goreshk and all those places where I served, all those places that we fought over for 10 or 12 years, where I can't imagine how difficult it was to exist as a civilian. And it's much better for them right now. It's much better because they have security and safety. Economically, they're probably no better off now than they were when we were there. Probably worse. There is a humanitarian crisis, which has happened since we left. But you're absolutely right. You can't eat an education. And the most important thing, as we all know, is to have security for your family. So there are, in some respects, I'm pleased for Afghanistan, but the war is over. Yeah, I am, genuinely so. I'm sad that it ended in the way that it did, with the return of a regime that has so quickly dismantled a lot of the very good things which we put in place over the 20 years that we were there. And we did all hope, many people thought, but we all hope that when the Taliban returned to power in 2021, it would be a more modern, progressive version of the Taliban that wouldn't repeat the mistakes that they made in the past. But we're not really seeing that yet. There are glimmers of hope. Yeah, there are glimmers of hope. Inevitably, the hardliners were going to exercise power after 2021 when they came. Inevitably, they'd fought hard for 20 years, so they deserve their place in government. But there are lots of more moderate members of the Taliban, and there are views, there are moves, and I just kind of really hope that if the Taliban stay around in power, that they moderate their views, particularly on education and equal rights, etc., etc. I hope they do, or let's hope that without conflict, the Taliban give way to something else in the future. But that's not going to happen for a while.
You've spoken already about the failures of the UK government to effectively resettle Afghans who are at risk of political persecution, religious persecution, and acts of retribution because of the work that they'd undertaken with the British Army and other international organisations. Other than the resettlement angle, what could have been done differently in 2021 when it came to the withdrawal from Afghanistan? Was it inevitable that it had to go down the way that it did because the alternative was propping up what, we agree to have been a very weak government concentrated around Kabul?
Again, it's a difficult question, and I'm conflicted on this one. But part of me believes that we should have stayed there. At the height of the war in about 2010, there were probably 150,000 coalition soldiers in Afghanistan. By 2021, there were about 10,000, maybe less. And I don't think any coalition soldier had lost his or her life in the last year of our campaign there. We were in a training, advisory, and assisting role, and it wasn't costing very much in blood or treasure. So we could have stayed there indefinitely if we had the strategic patience to do so. But a sort of series of events prevented us from doing there. The Doha agreement, there had to be some kind of political accommodation. I do agree with that. There had to be talks with the Taliban. There were failures in those talks, in that we had the Americans and we had the Taliban, and the Afghans were never really properly represented in those talks. And I think that always a massive failure. So I think, and then, but terms of the Doha agreement, with our withdrawal, I think most people assume that we, the United States rather than the United Kingdom, but NATO or the United States of a coalition, would retain some small military footprint in Afghanistan to continue to support the government of Afghanistan, to prevent it from collapsing and falling. And we could have done that, I think, is the view. I was really surprised in early 2021 when President Trump had gone, President Biden had taken over, and President Biden announced we would leave in 21 as per the Doha agreement. But then he said, but we would be leaving completely. Everybody would be out. And I remember thinking, wow, that is not a planning assumption that we've all worked on for the last 10 to 15 years. The assumption was always that there would be a residual, what we call a residual counter-terrorist base. One base, probably Bagram, small force, which would prevent the complete collapse of the government. And would that have made a difference, Ash? I don't really know. What would have happened if we'd pulled everybody out of Kabul, everybody out of Kandahar, everybody out of Herat, everybody out of the north, and we just left 2,000 or 3,000 American soldiers and a few others in Bagram? Would it have changed anything? I don't know. Would it potentially have just delayed the inevitable for another 5 years? Would there just have been a continued war with drone strikes and air strikes, but would have killed more civilians and more people, more Afghan soldiers and more Afghan civilians? Would we have just caused more death for another 5 years? I don't know. Or could we, would it have stabilized the situation over the next 5 years and ultimately resulted in a peace process? I genuinely don't know. I'm conflicted on this. I just kind of think what happened in August was we just cut and run. It was unseemly. It was undignified. And I think it was so unexpected for the Afghans. I talk about it pulled the rug from under their feet, within the space of a couple of weeks. All of their hopes for the future, all of their self-confidence, confidence in themselves, all of that evaporated. And that's why the whole deck of cards collapsed so quickly, June, July, and August. But again, it's only 3 years or so. And I think historians and others are going to rake over this for decades and draw their own analysis and their deductions as to what went wrong and how we could have done it better. What we had there wasn't perfect, as you've alluded to. The Karzai government was deeply corrupt, deeply, deeply corrupt. The writ of governance didn't really extend very far from Kabul. Those in Kabul got fat, happy, and rich. Those people out in provinces didn't see much benefit to us being there. They just saw war. So you're right. It was a very imperfect solution which we had there. It just seems really sad though that it's just all gone. So, as you say, some of it for good, but some of it definitely for worse. And as I always come back to, the 50% of the people that I feel most sorry for are the women and the children there. I feel really sorry for women and young girls.
I kind of want to come back to something which you mentioned earlier. You said that there was actually very little in the way of wrongdoing by British and American troops in Afghanistan, but a very recent BBC Panorama investigation suggested that one SAS squadron killed 54 people in suspicious circumstances in the space of about 6 months. Does that have the ring of truth to you, that something like that was going on, that there was a sort of larger scale of serious abuses of human rights, what you might describe as war crimes, or does that seem like an outlier based on your knowledge of the situation at the time?
Yeah, I've got to be sexist. I wasn't part of UK Special Forces at any time in my career, and certainly not in Afghanistan. So I can't really kind of comment as to what they were doing, to be quite honest. Would I be surprised? Yeah, I'd be mortified. I said this to a mate recently. I said I just feel absolutely devastated if any of these allegations about UK Special Forces were found to be true. I'd be devastated. It would undermine pretty much everything that I believed in the UK military, and what we were doing in Afghanistan. There are well-documented cases of war crimes amongst certain special forces. I think the Americans and particularly the Australian in Afghanistan. And many people watched how the Australian stories unfolded from disbelief through to fact. I think possibly even through to some convictions. I just hope to God, I really do, that these are vexatious allegations and that these aren't true. But I can't really comment much more beyond that, Ash. Those forces were right at the sharp end of the conflict. My experience of having operated and seen special forces in other theatres is, they're incredibly professional, incredibly restrained. As I say, I would be absolutely shattered if any of these allegations were true, but that's all I can say about it, Ash, to be honest.
I was quite interested to hear you speak just then about the emotional impact that it would have on you if these allegations were to turn out to be true. And I suppose as someone who, I don't know, one might describe as being sort of skeptical or critical towards, military institutions. For me, human rights abuses come as no surprise. It's a very consistent thread throughout military history. And I suppose I'm interested in how you balance what's obviously a very well-informed and critical and self-reflective disposition with your belief in the goodness and the morality of the army.
It's sad in a way that you view the military, in that way, because it doesn't ring with my experiences. But I, you're not unique, I suspect, Ash, in having deep skepticism about any military. It's a funny one because I've always felt what we were doing for the right reasons and what we were doing for good. But I can understand that, how I look at something may not be how others kind of looked at what we were doing. My early days, I say, I spent in Northern Ireland. Let's park that one for a minute. The Balkans. Yeah, my boy spent 6 months in Bosnia in 1994 at the height of the war, in harm's way, with the sole purpose of trying to protect civilians. That's what we were there for. I mean, it was just kind of simple as that. There was nothing malign about what we were doing. We were trying to enable the delivery of humanitarian aid to besieged communities in central Bosnia. We were trying to bring that war to an end. We were trying to prevent atrocities. We were trying to prevent everything that happened. It was about as altruistic as one can get. There can't be many better causes. I felt very good about what I was doing and very proud about what I was doing there. But the very fact that I might have carried a rifle, would put me in opposition in some people's eyes. What I was doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, I maybe not quite as noble causes, Ash, but I felt we were doing them for the right reasons. Whether at various times that was so that people could sleep safely in their beds in the United Kingdom and not worry about the threat of terrorism. Maybe not worry about the threat of Al Qaeda flying a jet into an office block in London or blowing themselves up in Birmingham. Or what I felt I was doing, even deployed on the ground in southern Afghanistan, I felt that I was protecting the civilian. You may laugh at this, Ash. I felt like I was protecting the civilian population from the Taliban, from a predatory and unpleasant enemy who we could offer something better to. So my 3 tours in Afghanistan, and I really believed in it, really, really believed in what I was doing. I believed in the offer, but what we could offer was better. Democracy, civil society, freedom, the right for girls to go to school, the right for girls to have an education. I felt that was better than what the Taliban were offering. So to me, it was a really, I've always felt that what I've done was a noble cause. And you may laugh at that slightly. And occasionally, as and when I read or heard about serious criminal offences taking place by soldiers, I was always horrified. And when they were convicted and sent to jail, I and my colleagues would say, well, throw the key away. They've brought us into disrepute. They've brought our profession into disrepute. Hundreds of soldiers died for a good cause. That idiot did something wrong, something illegal, and has brought us all into disrepute. But I can't change the way. I can't change your skepticism. But I just
No,
try.
I'm not.
Try. Most people think like me in the military. They're good people, and they're in there. They're not kind of gung ho, but in there for the bangs and the bullets and the bombs. They're there to do good work. And I think they really believe in it. If that makes sense.
No, that does. And I'm certainly, I'm neither trying to persuade you nor asking you to persuade me. I suppose this is a good time to talk about what's been in the news recently, which is about conscription. There has been a great deal of hullabaloo in the newspapers about this idea of if we do end up in a sort of full-scale war, particularly one on the European continent, there'll need to be conscription of young people. And as is so often the case on social media, there was a backlash to it driven by young people who were, to put it crudely, saying, fuck no, right? And there was one particular tweet that I saw which said, I'll serve crack before I serve this country. What do you think accounts for this sort of lack of faith or cynicism or suspicion of the army and its demands of young people? Because it sort of seems to me to be quite generationally distinct, that even people I know who've been in the army and are about my age, is that they've emerged from it feeling very cynical about the army as an institution.
Oh, I get that. And I don't think that's a new thing. The army's always struggled to recruit numbers, from when I was very young. There's always been a cadre of young men and women who for whom the army lifestyle has appealed. But for 95% of the population, it has never appealed. And I think you're absolutely right. It is becoming more of a problem in today's society. The concept of duty, I think, has changed even over my own lifetime. And I think, we live in an increasingly capitalist, materialistic society. We live in an increasingly selfish society. Communities are shattered. This idea of sense of community, I think. So I think, a lot of those traits and character traits that I think drove people into the military have to a certain extent gone, Ash. So doesn't surprise me. And then there are other sort of practicalities. Would I want to serve on a nuclear submarine if I was 18 years old now and be, out of touch with my friends and my family and social media and, for 6 months at a time? No thanks. But maybe back in the 1970s and 80s, it wasn't quite such a problem. But it is genuinely becoming more of a problem, I think. Society is changing, and it is becoming increasingly difficult to attract young men and women into the armed forces. Can't avoid that. That's kind of reality. This business of conscription, I think this was just blown completely out of proportion. The guy who said it's a lovely guy, General Patrick Sanders, who speaks his mind. He's quite candid. He's in his last 6 months in the job before he leaves. So he's probably feeling a little bit less politically constrained in what he says than he would do at any other time in his career. I mean, what can they do? Sack him? He's only a few months away from leaving. So I think what he was doing is he wasn't really talking about conscription. He never used the word conscription. I think what he was sort of rightly saying is he was highlighting, and I think he was right too, that there is an increasing threat from Russia at the moment to Europe. And that is a very real threat. And it is a threat which we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War and since about 1989, 1990. And we can just kind of blissfully ignore that threat and go on, just ignorant of it, spending, the smallest amount of money on defense as we possibly can do and not worrying about it in the hope that it goes away. Or you can say, okay, there is this chance that we could be at war at some point in the future, and not a war of choice, not like Iraq or Afghanistan, not a minor war that can be fought by a volunteer army. We could find ourselves in a situation like Ukraine. I don't think we're going to, Ash. I don't think we will, but it's possible in the next decade. And if we find ourselves in a war like Ukraine, then exactly as Ukraine has found, the professional army will be killed or wounded very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. It's exactly what's happened in the Ukrainian military. So who do you turn to? First of all, you try and say you encourage people to join. Good luck when lots of people are being killed. So you don't have much choice but to do some form of mobilization or worst case conscription. Worst case conscription. But I heard an academic talking about this the other day. The army's been around for 350 years. We've always had a voluntary army. I think we've only had a conscript army for about 20 or 30 years, if that, of that entire 350 years. The British has always had a volunteer army, and I don't think that will change. But what I think, General Patrick Sanders was saying is just, he was saying to society, he was saying to the government, saying to everybody, there is an increasing threat from Russia. We need to be alive to it. We probably need to look at how we spend our money and how we spend our tax, quite frankly, because there's not a bottomless pit of money, as we all know. And I think as we run into the next election and we run into, comprehensive spending reviews, where are we going to invest over the next 10 years? Is it going to be in the NHS? Is it going to be in the welfare state? Is it going to be in education? Is it going to be in defence? And these are the hard decisions, but I think, and we shouldn't leave it to the buffoons in Westminster to make these decisions. This needs to be a national debate. And I think what Patrick Sanders was doing was trying to make this a national debate. How important is defence to us? Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And I suppose my final question to wrap up lots of the themes that we've been discussing is that it seems to me that early on in your military career, you felt very certain about what this country stood for and what the army stood for. Do you still feel so certain about what this country stands for and what the army stands for?
Oh, that's a deep question. So I joined in 1985. We had a very clear enemy. It was very clear what our strategic competition was, and it was the Soviet Union. And everything we did was about countering the Soviet Union. And my parents, lived under the threat of a nuclear Armageddon if the Cold War was to go hot. And I saw the back end of that in 1985. When the Cold War finished in 1989, 1990, the world became a much more uncertain place. And people speculated that, warfare would die out. It would become so much more safe. And then, of course, since that time, we've seen more conflict than anybody perhaps anticipated. Not more than we've seen in history, but we've seen conflict in the Middle East. From the Gulf War in 1991 through to the Iraq War, through to everything which we're seeing. We see continued conflict in Iraq, Israel, and Palestine. We've seen, the rise of global terrorism, Al Qaeda, and now we're seeing a resurgent Russia. And people are slightly concerned about what we're seeing with China and Taiwan. So I have to say, it does seem to be a very uncertain world in which we live, to be honest, Ash. And then we're seeing other threats like cyber. And that is a threat that affects you and me and all of your viewers. They need to be alive to the threat from cyber attacks. And then we've seen, as we were brutally reminded recently, the threat of a pandemic, which none of us really thought about before COVID struck. But people have always said that is the single greatest threat to our existence, and our security, stability, and prosperity. And I don't think that's gone away. So there's this kind of range of threats, which is everybody. So yeah, we live on uncertain times. Second part of your question, Ash, is kind of, what's Britain's part in this? That's a brilliant question. It used to be a responsible player within Europe. It used to be able to play a significant role in influencing affairs because it was a member of Europe. But it's chosen to isolate itself now. So it's what? It's a country of 16 million with the sixth largest economy in the world. Still got quite a significant military, but it's one of the largest militaries. What is the UK and what is its place in the world? I think everybody's still trying to answer that kind of question. I think, coming back to a lot of what we've talked about, I think we've seen the end of these wars of choice. I don't see us getting involved in wars of choice for the foreseeable future. Iraq was a war of choice, and Afghanistan, most of the Afghanistan campaign was a war of choice. I think we need to focus more significantly on what are the existential threats to the United Kingdom, and that could be Russia, it could be China, whatever it is, and focus on that. It's really interesting. What is Britain's place in the world? I don't have the answers. I don't know if anybody does, but I do. Coming back, you'd expect me to say this. I do believe that a strong military is important. I really do. Given the uncertain times which we live in, I think having a strong military, because it provides a deterrent against those that may wish us harm, and because it can turn that deterrent into action should it be required, I think that is important. But I think what we've got to get right is this question of when and how we use military force. And this, again, is going to be the question for Israel at the end of this awful campaign in Gaza. Was it the appropriate use of force? Has it achieved the right political outcomes which were needed? Or is this just part of a continuum of violence that has existed for the last 100 years and will continue unless something changes?
Major General Charlie Herbert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ash. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.